When all around us voices are raised in anger, hatred spilling into the streets and sparking more hatred, sometimes the best we can do is just to sink our hands into the soil. Let the fights over abstractions ebb away, flow like water into the earth. Fill your fingers with dirt that is itself the product of rocks worn to powder over millennia, leavened with particles of other lives. Lives of leaves and vegetables and other animals, once as warm and active as you are now. Everything dies and returns to its source, breaks down into the ingredients of some new life, bits of humus, squirming bacteria, a tiny egg. This is real. The sun warm on your back, the soil cool under your bare feet, a tiny new stem that will unfurl to grow a sweet red tomato, and the hand of a friend gently helping you to rise. Even on our most difficult days, we can touch the soil and be grateful for the earth and the love that sustains us. At this time, we'll light our candles of community. If you have a joy or a concern, or you would just like to bring more light to the room, please light the candle. Let us stand in body or spirit for the lighting of the chalice. My beloved people, I cannot pretend, and so I will not tell you that everything is okay right now, that there is no reason to be angry, that you must be optimistic or at peace. I cannot pretend these things, and so I won't tell them to you. But now our chalice is it. And so all I ask in this moment is that we remember the words of Rebecca Parker. There is a love, there is a love holding us, there is a love holding all. By the light of our chalice, let us rest in this love. Let us say the spoken affirmation together. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth and freedom and to help one another. Our opening thought comes to us from James Howenstein, who's the author of No Return Address. These thoughts are from How Can I Help? During a crisis, you will find there are three types of people. First, there are people who will say, I don't care what happens to other people as long as it doesn't affect me. Second, there are people who will think, how can I rip people off and make money off this? Third, there are people who will ask, how can I help? Let us sing together for all that is our life. Or let us listen to the words of the song.
For all that is our life, we sing our thanks and praise. For all life is a gift, which we are called to use to build the common good and make our own days glad. For needs which others serve, for services we give, for work and its rewards, for hours of rest and love, we come with praise and thanks. For all that is our life, for sorrow we must bear, for failures, pain, and loss, for each new thing we learn, for fearful hours that pass, we come with praise and thanks. For all that is our life, for all that is our life, we sing our thanks and praise. For our life is our gift, which we are called to use to build the common good and make our own days glad.
Our next reading comes from Mariana Pogosyan from her essay, In Helping Others, You Help Yourself. Consider the positive feelings you experienced the last time when you did something good for someone else. Perhaps it was the satisfaction of running an errand for your neighbor, or the sense of fulfillment from volunteering at a local organization, or the gratification from donating to a good cause. Or perhaps it was the simple joy of having helped out a friend. This warm glow of pro-sociality is thought to be one of the drivers of generous behaviors in humans. One reason behind the positive feelings associated with helping others is that being pro-social reinforces our sense of relatedness to others, thus helping us meet our most basic psychological needs. For our practices this morning, hear these words from Paul Sawyer. In this difficult time, We call to our minds today the life of a person of peace, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We hope that, like Dr. King, we may have the courage to live our convictions even in the face of overwhelming opposition, that we may live a life dedicated to justice, equality, and peace. We think today about all those who are suffering the terror and desolation of war. We hope that all people may know peace and security, be free from fear of bombs, free from the horror of tyranny, free to live and to love. In particular, we lift up children, that they may know healing that salves the wounds of war, both physical and spiritual. We lift them up that they may live to know a life without fear. And we pray for ourselves and for those in our community and in our own families who suffer, who mourn, who face the extraordinary and the everyday difficulties and fears of this life. At times we are overwhelmed. At times we despair in the face of the forces of oppression and sickness, of violence and destruction. Our actions, our work, our faith amounts to nothing. Dr. King reminds us that with love and faith, one person really can change the world. Grant us ears to hear the prophets of our own time. May we have the wisdom to discern their message through the noise and discord of our lives. May we have the strength to do what must be done in this world. May we find the courage to live our lives as lives of conviction, of spirit, of faith. May we know justice and peace in our time. Our next reading is from the writings of Charles Delent. I don't want to live in the kind of world where we don't look out for each other, not just the people that are close to us, but anybody who needs a helping hand. I cannot change the way anybody else thinks or what they choose to do, but I can do my bit. I'd like to begin by thanking Doug for putting this picture of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood on the front of the bulletin and giving me a nice memory of my childhood. I appreciate that very much, Doug. And the title of my discourse this morning comes from the words of Mr. Rogers, the Reverend Mr. Rogers, "Look for the helpers." Since I was here with you, what's now been over a month ago, there have been a number of extremely difficult and tragic events for our country and for our world. And unfortunately, over the last few years, you could pick out any month and you'd have a number of tragic events for our country and for our world. But in this past month, in August, we experienced catastrophic and deadly flooding in Tennessee. And then just a few weeks later, the most powerful hurricane to ever make landfall in Louisiana wiped out homes, businesses, and communities, and then was followed by surprising flooding and many deaths across the northeastern part of the United States. Also in August, we witnessed the disturbing and chaotic end to America's longest war and the return to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And we know the oppression this will mean for millions of Afghans, especially for women and for girls. This week, thousands of Afghan refugees are already being located in communities across our country. And I hope that we will embrace them as neighbors and as friends. Over the last month, not only has our human community faced tragedy and the threat of tragedy, our ecological community has also experienced loss related to the uncontrolled wildfires in the West. And just this past week, some of the most majestic trees in the world, the giant sequoias of California, narrowly escaped the flames during a year of some of the worst wildfires ever seen. And they are not out of the woods yet, so to speak. While these fires raged, the world's climate scientists just this past week also reminded us that we are currently falling far short of the systemic changes required to avoid climate chaos by the end of this century. And if all of this were not enough, COVID-19, in the form of its more contagious and deadly Delta variant, has continued to ravage our communities and our families at an alarming and accelerated pace. And you and I live in two states where our leaders continue to put their heads in the sand by ignoring the urgency of implementing the most basic of public health measures that could save thousands of lives. Since I was with you last, we passed the grim milestone of over 10,000 Oklahomans dying of COVID. And nationally, more than 675,000 persons have died, making the number of U.S. Americans who have died of COVID-19 greater than the number of Americans who died in the 1918 flu pandemic. As scary as all of this is for us adults, imagine how scary it must be for children and for young people, especially those who are experiencing these tragic events directly. As I've seen these horrific events play out among us and around us, I have often found myself taking refuge in the words and thoughts of a person who gave me comfort and assurance during my childhood, one of my lifelong heroes, the Reverend Mr. Fred Rogers. In reflecting on how to help children through scary times and through tragic events, Mr. Rogers once wrote these words: "I was spared from any great disasters when I was little, but there was plenty of news of them in newspapers and on the radio, and there were graphic images of them in newsreels. For me, as for all children, the world could have come to seem a scary place to live in. But I felt secure with my parents, and they let me know that we were safely together whenever I showed concern about accounts of alarming events in the world. There was something else my mother did that I've always remembered. Always look for the helpers," she said. "There's always someone who is trying to help." I did, and I came to see that the world is full of doctors and nurses, police and firefighters, volunteers, neighbors, and friends who are ready to jump in to help when things go wrong. Reading these words from Mr. Rogers reminds me of the times that he helped me when I was a small child, growing up during the Vietnam War, seeing friends whose families were split apart by that war, seeing friends whose fathers were killed by that war. Reading these words from Mr. Rogers reminds me that if more people looked up to Mr. Rogers as their role model, especially men, especially boys, rather than looking to examples of toxic masculinity, that many of the world's problems would be much more on their way to being solved than they are now. Perhaps it would even be helpful for many of our world leaders to watch some episodes of Mr. Rogers when they come together for their global summits and their global meetings. Mr. Rogers' words remind me that in the midst of all that has happened and that is happening in our world today, there are so many persons and communities of persons who have been helpers. The persons who rescued others from the storms and the floods. The persons who tried to save and evacuate as many people as possible from Afghanistan in the midst of both the risk and, sadly, the reality of death. The firefighters who have saved as many homes, communities, and forests as possible. And the incredible yet underappreciated healthcare workers who continue to work countless hours to save so many, regardless of their vaccination status. These helpers are amazing, and we should be so thankful, so grateful for all that they have done and what they are doing to save as much as possible from being lost in these incredibly challenging times. But in addition to being grateful, I suggest that we should also feel anger. We should be angry that the helpers among us are being taken advantage of, abused, and put in positions that are untenable. Many of the helpers are getting sick, are dying, and being put in extremely dangerous situations, many of which could have been avoided if we as a society had heeded the warnings of the climate scientists, refrained from 20-year-long wars of failed nation building, and taken the basic mitigation measures necessary during a public health emergency, rather than selfishly clinging to a false notion of freedom without social responsibility. Yes, we should look for the helpers, but we should also be looking to help the helpers by finding ways together to create a world in which we no longer put the helpers at unnecessary risk. We should work together to create a world in which we no longer require exploitation of helpers for our survival. By creating such a world, we all become a part of the community of helpers as well. That's not to say that there will be some tragedies, some disasters, some circumstances that are out of our control, and we'll still need the helpers to help us during those times and oftentimes put their lives at risk. But there are so many risky situations that we could avoid if we come together and work together to do that. Yes, in these times of trouble, follow Mr. Rogers' advice and the advice of his mother to look for the helpers. But when we find them, let's help them. Let's work to protect them. Let's create systems in our society to avoid a never-ending cycle of tragic events. Let's not only look for the helpers, but let us also be the people that Mr. Rogers' mother encouraged him to look for as a child. Let us be the ones who bring assurance and safety and care to the children and to others who are so frightened by the scary events of our world that we are experiencing in the world today. Together, we can work to make a world that is a little less scary place for them to live in. Let us look for the helpers. Let us be the helpers. Let us be the helpers of the helpers. And let us help one another build beloved community together. May it be so with our help. This time we'll have our time of giving. Those who wish may bring their gifts to the table. And also you can give on the church mobile app home screen. The work and mission of this congregation in this community. Let us stand together in body or spirit for our parting thought and the extinguishing of the chalice. Our parting thought comes from Leo Buscaglia, from Love, What Life is All About. The purpose of life is to help others, and if you can't help them, won't you at least not hurt them? I know that is a platitude, that is sentimental and can be easily attacked, but loving, caring is simple, and we make it complex. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.